So, it's been a hell of a year, huh? Certainly, there's no shortage of things that one could talk about. Pandemic hits, the country goes into lockdown, and now, as we near the end of the year, large segments of the country remain in lockdown, even as increasing amounts of data continue to stream in, indicating that the lockdown strategy, at best, was ineffective at mitigating the spread of the virus, or at worst, may have been downright detrimental and perhaps may have made things worse. Riots gripped the country during the summer, and in fact, as I record this, rioting has recently flared up again in Philadelphia. And throughout most of these riots, the authorities have been either powerless to stop them or have actively encouraged and fomented the chaos. In many cases, police departments have been told by higher ups to stand down, to not arrest people. And in cases where rioters were arrested, prominent political figures have solicited donations for bail funds designed to get these people out of jail. Through it all, the media has been running what I can only describe as a gargantuan, society-wide, and absolutely psychotic gaslighting operation designed to make you doubt the evidence of your own eyes. It doesn't matter that you've seen countless live streams of violent rioting and looting, of buildings being burned, businesses being destroyed, people having their livelihoods shattered, people being assaulted, and other assorted types of savagery. No. You see, the protests have been mostly peaceful. Mostly peaceful protests, they tell you, as buildings burn down right behind them. The revelations recently that have come out because of Hunter Biden's laptop, the information about financial corruption, all the dirty dealings involving the Biden family in places like Ukraine, China, Kazakhstan, and some other areas. And also some much worse things on that laptop, which I'm not going to discuss here, but I assume that if you're watching this, you already know what I'm referring to. Also, we've had information even more recently come out that Biden apparently has made deals with some sort of prominent Chinese spy. It's all insane. And again, through it all, the press, the corporate press, is trying desperately, scrambling madly to cover up this story and to scream at the top of their lungs at anyone who will listen, which thankfully is a diminishing number of people, that the story is Russian disinformation. Now, what evidence do they have that this is all a product of a Russian disinformation campaign? Oh, none whatsoever. None whatsoever. Just a few spooks from the CIA who signed some document and said that it was. But of course, that doesn't prove anything. That's not evidence. But nevertheless, it is demanded of us that we believe such things. So there's all sorts of chaos going on. And therefore, we're not exactly at a loss for finding topics to discuss. But there is something in particular that I want to discuss for a number of reasons that through my discussion I hope will be made clear. What I want to talk about here, though, is a phenomenon that's emerged in about the last year or two that's really sort of come to prominence, and that's this thing we call woke capitalism. See, for reasons that are not entirely clear, American corporations have suddenly begun ostentatiously embracing the left-wing, social justice warrior, critical race theory sort of anti-white kind of narrative, both about the history of the United States in particular and about politics more generally. They've done this through various ad campaigns that sort of signal their political allegiances. They've donated to various causes and so on. And this is very odd because often the companies doing this face consumer backlashes and so lose money by engaging in such campaigns, and yet they continue to do so. What's going on? What the hell is this? And isn't it troubling, many critics have said, that these large, powerful corporations seem to have embraced this corrosive political agenda? So what's going on? Well, a number of people have already made plenty of videos discussing this subject and have offered their thoughts on it. And the reason why I have chosen finally to jump into the fray myself is because I've heard a number of these other proposed explanations and I don't find any of them satisfying. In fact, the whole thing is rather irksome and annoying to me because I regard the true explanation for this phenomenon as rather obvious. And so it does surprise me that no one quite seems to have come upon the right answer to this. But there have been, as I say, a number of proposed explanations. For instance, True Diltom, now going under the name Neuroposter, made a video a while back about why he thinks American corporations have gone woke, and what he says essentially is that woke ideology has certain peculiar characteristics that make it an especially useful instrument of social control. And because it is allegedly such a peculiarly useful instrument of social control, and so especially effective at achieving that end, it then allows corporations to corral their workers, to threaten them with the loss of their jobs and their livelihoods, and thereby to get them to be obedient to the dictates of corporate management and essentially conform and do those things which corporations require them to do. And so it's a useful tool in the conflict between capital and labor. Now, I don't regard this explanation as plausible in the slightest, and here is why. Corporations, for as long as they have existed, have always had a perennial interest in enforcing conformity and in controlling people. This, to some degree or another, is an element of every collective organization. To maintain cohesion within an organization, you cannot allow an unacceptably high degree of, let's say, individual freedom within the organization, because then every member is off doing his own thing, and the cohesion that should be a part of the organization in order to make it a single organization breaks down, and then you don't have an organization anymore. So this is really just in the nature of what corporations do. They corral workers, they enforce conformity, and they get them to work towards some end. That's always what they have been doing. However, woke ideology is a relatively recent phenomenon. And not just woke ideology, but specifically woke capitalism is especially recent. It's something we've only really seen come to the fore in the last year or two. And you can't really appeal to a perennial set of economic interests that corporations have had in order to explain a recent phenomenon, because then you must also answer the question of why it is that this ideology was not embraced sooner by corporations, and not only why it wasn't embraced sooner by corporations, but why it wasn't thought up by corporations decades or even centuries ago. Woke ideology in one form or another has been around since at least the 80s. Critical race theory has been around since the 80s. Peggy McIntosh wrote that essay, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, which introduced the phrase white privilege into our academic and cultural lexicon, and that was in 1988. So if it is really true that woke ideology is peculiarly able to enable corporations to enforce conformity, one wonders why we didn't see people being fired from their jobs for making racially insensitive jokes in 1988 or 1990. Why is this only happening now? So that explanation is inadequate. Another explanation offered by Michael Rechtenwald, the former and now reconstructed and rehabilitated Marxist, who is rather glorious in his hatred of Marxists now, I must say. He, at one point, propounded a theory. I don't know how much he still adheres to this, but I have heard him say this. This was his attempt to explain woke capitalism. Woke ideology consists of an enormous profusion of different identity categories. And it tends to splinter people up into those identity categories. You know, the 72 genders and so forth. And by splintering people into these numerous identity categories, you thereby are able to create an enormous congeries of niche markets that corporations can each appeal to. By appealing to those markets, they can exploit them, they can market specific products to them, and they can then extract revenue from those niche markets and thereby make money. And that, so the explanation goes, serves the economic interests of corporations. Now, this does not work either. Here's why. Companies which market products to large mass markets, which sell to the mass consumer, always earn more revenue than those companies which cater to smaller niche markets. And the reason why is obvious. There are more people in a mass market. There are more consumers there. Therefore, the aggregate amount of total money is greater. And the amount of revenue that a corporation can extract by selling products to that market is therefore also correspondingly greater. Also, niche markets tend to be structured in very specific ways. That is, the consumers which make them up have specific tastes and specific desires. And these all differ from one niche market to the next. And so, if you are a corporation and it is required of you to cater to a collection of small niche markets, you have to initiate multiple market research campaigns into each of these niche markets to discover their differences, to discover the ways in which to best market products to each of those markets. You then also have to make investments in research and development in order to create products which cater to those specific interests and to those specific desires, to those specific demands. You have to alter your products in very particular ways. On the other hand, if you're simply selling to one mass market, you can offer them a relatively homogenized product, which means less investment in R&D per unit of product ultimately sold or brought to market. So it's not clear how any of this would actually be beneficial to a corporation's bottom line. I think that explanation is just based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how corporations approach markets and how they market and sell products and so forth. So that doesn't work. Another explanation that has been proffered, that has been given, is that let's call them the managerial class, the professional class, the managers and CEOs of corporations, but also the bureaucrats who staff the administrative agencies in the state. These people have an interest in creating a fractured and atomized society in which people are not able to derive identity from things like churches, from their local communities, even from their families. And so their roots within their societies are severed from them, and the individual becomes atomized and is just sort of adrift. And when the individual is so adrift, he is much more amenable to becoming a pliable, pliant kind of slave of the administrative state, and also a placid consumer who will just buy whatever the corporations happen to be trying to sell him. And so an atomized person with no roots, with no identity, with no conception of what his place is within his society, is easy to manipulate, both by the state and by large corporate entities. And so therefore, these groups have an advantage in pushing such an ideology upon society. And so that's the explanation of that. Now, again, this, while I think there is some truth in this, it is also wrong for certain subtle reasons, and I hope that what those reasons are will become clear as I eventually get into what I take to be the correct explanation for why we're seeing woke capitalism now. Another explanation that has been given is just that when corporations donate to Black Lives Matter, when Gillette makes things like their toxic masculinity ad and so forth, they're simply signaling. They're advertising their membership within a certain social group. And that is correct. I agree with that. However, that explanation, if we're simply to leave it at that, is incomplete and it leaves out a number of things. So, as I say, I'm not satisfied with any of the typical explanations that I've heard given. So, if none of these explanations work, what the hell is going on then? What do I think is happening? Well, to understand woke capitalism, you first have to understand the ways in which subcultures form, develop, and sort of generally exist. And so the discussion that I'm going to give here is going to be a bit general, but after I set out the general idea, I'm going to draw draw specific examples, make specific parallels, and hopefully that will be sufficient to make what I'm getting at clear. So, in the beginning, you have a small group of people. Let's call them the innovators. Innovators are oddballs. They are weirdos. For one reason or another, they find themselves feeling alienated or disaffected from the mainstream culture. Perhaps there is some sort of hypocrisy, some sort of weakness, some sort of problem in the mainstream culture that these people have been able to perceive. And this perception, which, at least in the beginning of such movements, tends to be accurate, inspires the innovators to begin a sort of rebellion against the mainstream by setting up some particular subculture. And they do this by inventing some kind of new cultural form. It doesn't really matter what that cultural form is. It could be a new style of dress, it could be a new style of music, a new political ideology, a new religion even. It doesn't matter. Just some novel cultural form is created by these innovators. And because they are alienated people, and because they are swimming against the tide and must set themselves up in opposition to the mainstream culture, they tend to be highly creative, highly interesting, often highly intelligent, especially when we're talking about intellectual products, new ideologies, new philosophies, new ideas of that sort. Such people tend to be, as I say, intelligent, creative, perceptive, and also psychologically abnormal. The kind of people who not only are not cowed by peer pressure, but which actually tend to become encouraged to further flout mainstream norms as it's made clear to them that they're doing so, that they take a kind of pleasure in being rebels. They take pleasure in going against the grain. So this group of people starts the trend, starts the new subculture, creates the new cultural form. Then another group of people, let's call them the early adopters, follows the innovators, and so the early core of the nascent subculture is formed. Now, the early adopters are very similar to the innovators. Perhaps they're not quite as creative, perhaps they're not quite as interesting or quite as intelligent, but the differences between these two groups are rather small in that regard. The early adopters are still people who tend to be ahead of the curve. They're also psychologically abnormal, interesting, perceptive. They have something worthwhile to say, generally. Something important that they're offering, something meaningful, or at least something interesting. And so as the new subculture comes into its own, it forms its own set of mores, its own set of rules, its own set of ways by which members of the subculture can distinguish fellow members from outsiders. So this could be a way of dressing, a certain way of speaking, the fact that people might live in a certain given neighborhood, essentially anything, just certain things that can distinguish in-group members with respect to the subculture from out-group members. And the ability to carve out such distinctions is then used by the members of the subculture, by the innovators and the early adopters, to arrogate social status to themselves. Since the new subculture tends to arise from some sort of criticism of the mainstream, by distinguishing themselves from the mainstream, the the members of the subculture can signal to their fellow members that they're better than the normies. Basically, they're more insightful, they're more interesting, they understand something that the normies just don't get. You know, this could be that having a certain niche musical taste, or as I say again, anything. It depends on what the particular cultural form we happen to be discussing is. And so, as the members of the new subculture start gaining social status in this way, others begin to notice what's going on, and they start wanting a piece of the action. Human beings naturally are social creatures, and they want social status. And if they find some group doing something interesting, somewhere where there is some kind of creative ferment or energy afoot, and if the people involved, the people at the cutting edge, have social status as a result of their involvement, well, then others, outsiders, begin to want that social status. Thus, the subculture begins to grow. More people begin flooding into it. And as more people flood into it, necessarily what will happen is that the psychological characteristics of the new members that are flooding in will tend to be more like those of the average person. They will be more normie-like, more normie-esque, and less like those of the original innovators and the early adopters. As the trend starts picking up steam and growing, this is the point where the large corporations come in. They notice that there is now a demand present for the special kind of social status associated with membership in the subculture. They notice that people desire that social status, and so necessarily they begin offering that social status to people. However, since the mass consumer is a normie, does not have the special psychological peculiarities of the early adopters and of the innovators, the cultural form that these early members created has to be taken by the corporations, and it has to be watered down and made more palatable to the average consumer, to the typical normie. It has to be something that doesn't scare him off and that allows him to enjoy easy social status without much work, without having to put in the labor and the effort required to become an interesting person, without putting in the work required to become skilled at something. You know, the sorts of things that the innovators and the early adopters had to do. So corporations then repackage the subculture, water it down, and begin offering cheap social status to the masses. As this happens, the innovators and the early adopters begin to notice something. They begin to notice that the subculture that they were once involved in from its earliest days just isn't cool anymore. The creative energy that was present in the early days is no longer there. There are essentially too many normies there. They've ruined everything, because now the psychological brew, the psychological mix that exists among all the members, now that you've had this enormous influx of normies, has been diluted, and now the creative people that started the movement, the oddballs, the interesting kind of weird characters, they're minorities now, and so they necessarily can no longer steer the development of the subculture, and so the subculture becomes boring, bland, homogenized, and uninteresting. It becomes kitschy, and so forth. At this point, the innovators and the early adopters begin complaining, and they may even leave the subculture entirely, abandon it, and go off to start something new, and then essentially just begin the process again. And this is basically how all subcultures develop, including woke ideology. Okay, so the point I want to make here is the fact that large corporations have now globbed onto this thing is an indication that it is already mainstream. See, those on the dissident right who oppose this cultural development, they want to say that corporations are pushing this kind of thing on the masses. And this just isn't true, because, well, let's put it this way. It's true to a slight extent, but not nearly to the extent that they imagine it to be the case. So, in particular, it's just not the case that if not for the intervention of these corporations, that the trend would not have caught on at all, that it would not have gathered any steam at all. No, the fact that corporations have globbed onto this thing is already an indicator that there is some steam behind it. See, the unfortunate thing, if you're a part of the dissident right, this is what it means to be a dissident. You have to acknowledge the fact that the culture around you is decadent and degraded, and this is uncomfortable to acknowledge. It may be comforting to say that there is some sort of decadent and horrid elite that's pushing poison on the masses, and that were it not for this intervention, the masses would revert to their basically decent and innocent state. But that's not true. The public itself has been corrupted to some degree. And corporations aren't driving this. They aren't manufacturing it from nothing. They're jumping on a bandwagon relatively late in the game, frankly, and they're pushing a thing that before had been the preserve of an exclusive set of weirdos, and they're pushing it onto the masses. So corporations are Johnny-come-latelys. When large corporations glob onto something, it means that the trend has already been basically or just about mainstreamed anyway. It's already on the cusp of mainstream acceptance. To take something that is a genuine subculture, to take something that really is a niche phenomenon that few people are associated with, and to attempt to spread it to the masses is just not something that large corporations do. The reason why they don't do that is because attempting to do that would be an enormous risk for said corporations. Only a small number of people in the early stages have adopted the mores and the ways of behaving and the tastes associated with that given subculture. And therefore, the subculture has only demonstrated an ability to appeal to a small segment of the population. It is by no means a sure thing that this appeal will carry over from this exclusive set of weirdos with which it started over to the mass man. In fact, it probably won't, because, again, the early adopters and the innovators tend to be peculiar people. So to simply take something that's genuinely niche and that's genuinely avant-garde and to attempt to push it on the masses is just too much of a risk. Large corporations control enormous amounts of capital, and for them to take a risk like that and to put that capital at risk, it's just not the sort of thing that they would do. If they jump on something, if they attach themselves to something and begin marketing something, it is usually because that something has already demonstrated itself in some form or fashion to be a proven commodity. It's something that they already know that they can use. Now, with smaller firms, with smaller companies, of course, the story is different. A smaller firm controls a much smaller amount of capital. It may be designed to appeal to some niche taste or niche market, and if it attempts the risk of a mass marketing campaign, it probably won't work out. But then again, it might, and if it does, that small company will grow into a large corporation. See, here's the rule of thumb when it comes to corporations. Companies are started by interesting people, founded by interesting people, and then run and managed by boring people. And this especially becomes the case once the corporation becomes large and once it has a large amount of capital and a large number of assets to defend. Once you have an empire, you need a large and reliable set of boring, predictable, conscientious company men to guard your interests, to make sure that things continue to function from one day to the next, and part of that involves not taking overly great risks. So it's not that corporations are pushing something on the masses, it's that this thing, woke ideology, unfortunately has, to a large degree, spread organically throughout the populace. Corporations have noticed it. After all, virtually everyone in the social circle of your typical corporate manager or member of the managerial class already subscribes to something like this, and so they push it. Now, what's interesting about this is that you, of course, may have noticed that often when corporations make especially ostentatious and obnoxious attempts to push this kind of ideology, many of their consumers revolt and they end up losing money. Get woke, go broke, as the phrase goes. Now, I think that there's actually an enormous market for anti-wokeism that is just waiting to be tapped. Now, it hasn't been tapped yet by large corporations because the anti-woke sentiment hasn't quite spread far enough. If you spend the hours of your day lurking through obscure, dissident right-wing corners of the internet, you might come to the conclusion that everyone despises and abominates woke ideology. But that simply isn't the case. It may be true within your niche bubble, and after all, that bubble tends to consist of people who are ahead of the curve, of innovators and early adopters. And so corporations don't jump on that, even though there probably is money to be made if they do. It's just that right now things appear risky. But as the momentum behind anti-wokeism continues to grow, I expect that corporations will eventually jump on anti-wokeism as well. And you'll see the same thing. You will see the ideas of anti-wokeism get watered down, and the original proponents and theoreticians associated with the dissident right will grow disillusioned and bored with what we're witnessing. And the same sorts of things will be observed again, and the pattern will repeat itself. Now, in case anyone doubts that this explanation is correct, I'm going to spend the rest of this video basically taking a subculture at random and going through it, discussing its kind of sociological characteristics, and then drawing parallels between those sociological characteristics and equivalent sociological characteristics within those who adhere to woke ideology. Now, I'm going to be talking about metal. Okay, I know a lot about the metal subculture, love metal, listen to tons of it, so that's what I'm going to be talking about. And if you don't care about this, if you're not interested in this particular subculture, that doesn't matter. This is just an example. You can take whatever it is that you happen to be interested in, and I'm sure you can draw similar parallels yourself. All right, for example, I mentioned that every subculture has ways in which its members are able to distinguish themselves from the mainstream and signal to fellow members that they are members. There are also gradations to this, and these gradations become increasingly important as the subculture spreads and as more people come to be involved in it. So what I mean here is that previously, in an early stage when the subculture was small, it may only have been necessary to do a small number of very particular things in order to set yourself apart from the masses. But as the masses come to adopt those things, those ways of dressing, those particular musical tastes, those particular political opinions, it then becomes necessary to take those things which previously were sufficient to distinguish yourself from the masses and to ratchet them up, to make them more extreme. So here's a very obvious example of this. When Metallica released the Black Album in 1991, they became enormously successful. The album sold something like 15 million copies. They toured all over the world. Millions of people listened to Enter Sandman or Nothing Else Matters and so on. But there was a group of people who were not happy about this, who were in fact angry about this. And who were those people? Those were the people who listened to Metallica from the early days, from the 80s, since Kill 'Em All or Ride the Lightning. And they were saying that Metallica had sold out, that they'd gone mainstream, that they'd watered down their sound to appeal to a mass market, that they were no longer on the cutting edge, and that this was particularly egregious because Metallica, and by extension thrash metal, which they started, began as a reaction against the kitschy and over-commercialized glam metal of the 80s, where every band had to have, some cheap saccharine power ballad and they all sounded the same. And bands like Metallica eventually said, no, to hell with that. We're not doing that. We're going back to basics. We're going to be loud. We're going to play fast. We're going to be aggressive and abrasive. And we're going to be what metal is supposed to be, namely not palatable to the average consumer. And so the early Metallica fans were furious about this. Metallica sold out. Now, what's interesting more recently is that if you go on places like Metal Archives, which is a hotbed of metal elitism, you will find another narrative about Metallica's transformation that's quite prominent. Because it's now become widely accepted among metalheads that Metallica sold out when they released the Black Album. And so if you want to show people that you're, a true metalhead, that you're really, really into the cutting edge and the avant-garde of this music, that you're not a poser, you're for real, that's no longer enough. You actually then have to change the narrative, and I've indeed seen people change the narrative and go further and say, actually, no. It didn't start with the Black Album. Actually, it was Master of Puppets that started the decline. See, Master of Puppets is what really sucked, because that album was, they say, too similar to Ride the Lightning, and they start making up all sorts of reasons to try and justify why that was really the start of the decline. And the reason they do this is because relatively few people do that. And so if you can show yourself to have an extreme and unusual opinion like that, you can signal your membership in an exclusive club. You can see a very easy parallel to this in woke ideology. Just look at the ways that people speak. If you refer to black people as people of color, well, that indicates quite clearly, where your political allegiances lie. You can tell that pretty easily. You're on board for the woke agenda. You agree with it. Not only do you agree with it, but you're probably on the cutting edge of it. And as new linguistic and cultural innovations begin emerging out of it, you probably will adopt them as well in order to signify not just your general membership in the group, but specifically your membership and your place on the cutting edge of that group. However, if you refer to black people as African Americans, well, you're not on the cutting edge anymore. You may agree with significant segments of woke ideology. In fact, you probably agree with most of it. But you may regard certain recent developments as being deplorable excesses. So you may have some minor criticisms here and there. Or even if you don't have minor criticisms, you just might be the kind of person that is more of a normie and doesn't keep up with these sorts of arcane ideological developments. Now, to those who are on the cutting edge, this is already enough to brand you as, a racist and declare you to be anathema, even though someone who routinely refers to black people as African Americans is probably on board with the vast majority of what the vanguard of wokeism wants. If, though, you refer to black people as black people, well, you may not be able to make an exact determination from that, but it's probably safe to say that you tend more toward rejecting woke ideology than you tend toward accepting it. You reject more of it than you accept. You might accept certain parts of it, certain bits here and there, certain areas of it, certain aspects of it, but compared to the portion of woke ideology that you reject, those bits are relatively small, and so on the whole, you're out of step with the ideology. On the other hand, if you refer to black people just as blacks, like Jared Taylor or Ryan Falk might, well, then you're totally out of step with it. You don't buy any of it. Like you completely reject it, root and branch. You want nothing to do with it. You don't at all buy into the woke, anti-white narrative. And finally, if you refer to black people as joggers, let's say, well, then not only do you reject woke ideology, but you reject it ostentatiously. And you want to make a big show of just how strongly and how stridently you reject it. Um, so yeah, you can have these kind of fine gradations of that allow you to distinguish not only membership of a subculture but degree of membership and whether you are on the vanguard or not. Um, and sometimes these things are they might seem ridiculous to outsiders. Like take the term people of color. An outsider to woke culture might look at that with some suspicion and say, people of color? What the hell is this? We call them people of color right now? Doesn't that sounds a lot like colored people? And isn't that sort of vaguely racist? Why are we doing this? That's what an outsider would say. Of course, to an insider, that's ridiculous. And the point here is that the way that insiders distinguish themselves from outsiders is through arcane, trivial, and possibly even stupid things like this. And indeed, as the subculture spreads and as its premises and ways of behavior become more accepted, those on the vanguard have to resort to progressively more ridiculous things in order to continue to distinguish themselves from the mainstream. Um, so, the example with Metallica that I gave works perfectly well. Innovators. Well, you see this also in woke ideology as well. But let's give an example from the metal community. Chuck Schuldiner, one of my favorite musicians. He basically was the guy who invented death metal. There's a whole argument between metalheads about whether Possessed or Death was really the first metal band. I'm not going to get into that. I don't consider Possessed to be death metal. If you disagree, fight me. I don't care. But, okay, so Chuck Schuldiner basically started death metal, and he was the lead guitarist and frontman for the band Death. And not only was he an innovator, but he was an inveterate innovator. He wasn't like a one-off innovator where he just invented death metal. He was the first to kind of pioneer this extreme sound. And then for the rest of his career, he sort of rested on his laurels and just kept doing that. That wasn't what he did at all. In fact, it's pretty clear that by about 1994 or 1995, the first Death album was released in 1987, but by about 1994 or 1995, right around when Symbolic came out, Chuck Schuldiner was just completely sick and tired of death metal. He was tired of it. He'd had enough of the scene, and it's clear from watching interview snippets with him that he considered the scene to be congealing, that it was becoming boring and formulaic, that something which a few years before had been innovative and different, and where earlier groups had been sort of expanding things and pushing the boundaries and introducing kind of new ways of playing extreme music, things had congealed into an orthodoxy. Formulas developed for how to write a death metal riff, how to write a song, how to do the vocals, the ways to start drumming, the ways to incorporate, blast beats and so on. It became a formula. And it was very clear that he was becoming bored with that. And you see this in the last two Death albums. Symbolic today is regarded as a classic, and most people love it. But at the time, it was panned. People hated it. And it was a pretty serious departure from standard death metal. And indeed, all of Death's albums were different from one another. Scream Bloody Gore, very kind of raw, unpolished. Leprosy also retains a lot of that rawness. There's still some older thrash metal elements in it. Spiritual Healing, things slow down. It becomes much more of a standard death metal album. And then from Human on, increasing amounts of melodicism creep into the music. Individual thought patterns introduces an enormous amount of complexity. Symbolic basically becomes the first melodic death metal album with tons of these, sort of melodic passages. And then the Sound of Perseverance just goes full prog, right? So he never made the same album twice. It was important for him to constantly innovate, and indeed he seemed to be the kind of person that couldn't stand not being on the cutting edge. That whenever too many people got into a scene and it became formulaic, he'd get bored and he'd want to move on to the next thing. And indeed, by the end of his run in death and close to his own death from brain cancer, he finally got tired of death, ended the band, and started a new band called Control Denied, which was basically like a progressive power metal band, which was the direction that he wanted to go in. And interestingly, he had been trying to secure permission from his record label for years before doing this. And the record label, as you might expect, was reticent to do it because within the death metal community, death was an established commodity. The record label knew that people in this subculture liked this band. It had staying power. It had proven that people enjoyed it and that they would buy records from it. And even though Chuck was no longer interested in making that type of music, the record label just said, no, we're not gonna allow you to form a whole new band, change your style completely, and do something totally different because that's too much of a risk. Eventually, he was able to persuade them to do it, but they required him to make one more Death album, and that was The Sound of Perseverance. And if you listen to it, you can tell just by the musical structure of the songs on that record that those songs were supposed to be Control Denied songs, and that he basically recycled them and threw on harsh vocals onto them and made what he made. Now, as a parallel to woke ideology, you may have already noticed that many of the early adopters of this subculture, this ideology, are beginning to complain, many of them rather loudly and stridently, that the movement is being co-opted, that white people, boring, bland white people, are buying into their premises now, are accepting them, are watering down the things that they want done and accomplished, and essentially are just creating something that's more palatable to the masses. I mean, for instance, the original adherents of wokeism were quite radical. I mean, they would surely have wanted large corporations run by white people, for example, to divest themselves of their assets and to donate them to non-white communities. And even though corporations now with this woke capitalism phenomenon might make some token gestures, some token donations to that effect, they don't come anywhere close to full divestment. So you'll have the CEO of Chick-fil-A polish some black guy's shoes, and then the black guy jokes, "How about some stock options?" And the CEO gives him flashes him this look like, "Get the fuck out of here. We're not doing that." So, again, a kind of more palatable, less extreme version of the same ideology. Now, the adherents to wokeism, the early adopters and the innovators, complain that this is co-optation, and that's not exactly true. See, what I described earlier is that large corporations, jump on the bandwagon of a certain cultural movement once that movement has already demonstrated some staying power. But this isn't quite like co-optation. It's not that they're taking the movement and changing it and twisting it in a nefarious way to try and defang it. Rather, what's going on is that because of the movement's observed and growing popularity, social status comes to be associated with it. And so corporations, when they market a new subculture, are essentially selling social status to people. This also explains, by the way, why corporations continue to engage in this behavior even if it damages their bottom line. The people who express surprise over this have a very truncated view of what economic rationality is like. They think that if some behavior leads to a company suffering losses, business losses, then that behavior is irrational, especially if the company persists in the behavior. But the proper way of conceptualizing this is not to think in terms of monetary profit and loss, but psychic profit and loss. Now, here's what I mean. Buying a Rolex is not a prudent financial decision, okay? But people buy them anyway. Why? Because there's social status associated with having something like a Rolex or a Lamborghini. You're not going to make money from buying these things. You're not going to make money from buying a Lamborghini or any car, really, because the value of any car begins depreciating immediately after you buy it. So that it's not a purchase that's made to generate a return for you. It's done so that you can signal your social status. In addition to buying the good itself, you are also buying the social status associated with the good. And if the amount of social status offered to you by buying that good is greater than whatever monetary losses you might experience from buying the good, or is at least sufficient to compensate you psychically for those losses, you'll do it. So, if the managers at Gillette are sufficiently committed to woke ideology, they will keep promoting it even if it costs them money. And they'll keep doing it until they can't do it anymore, until it's no longer able to justify itself, or until the tide shifts and anti-wokeism becomes sufficiently mainstreamed that there comes to be a market, a relatively large market, and a relatively substantial amount of social status associated with being a member of that particular group. And then things will change. So I think that pretty much covers it. And as I say, I regard all of this as completely obvious. And it's very strange to me that more people haven't globbed onto this. What I see instead most of the time on the dissident right is a great deal of worry. So they'll notice that corporations are promoting woke ideology, and then they'll worry that corporations have this enormous power, that they're essentially brainwashing and manipulating the public, and if something isn't done, say some sort of government action to prevent this, then we're headed for hell in a handbasket, basically. And I disagree entirely with this. I think the people who are voicing this fear are exaggerating the power of corporations. Corporations don't create markets. They don't steer consumer demand. They observe trends that form organically in the early stages, and then they jump on the bandwagon relatively late. Corporations are Johnny-come-latelys, especially large ones, for the reasons that I already gave. Look, if you believe that it is possible for a corporation to come up with a snazzy advertisement or some sort of manipulative gimmick, and to thereby make people who would not be inclined to accept whatever the corporation wants them to accept or buy whatever product the corporation wants them to buy, to change their minds and then accept whatever is being propounded or buy whatever is being sold. I have a very simple challenge for you. Since we're talking about metal, let's look into the extreme side of it. Okay, and this goes double if you're not a metalhead. If you are, you'll already know immediately where I'm going. But if you don't believe me, pause this video, go on YouTube, and look up a certain album by a band called Suffocation. I'm picking this at random. Look up the album Effigy of the Forgotten, and listen to it. And you won't have to listen long. Just a few seconds will suffice, and you'll see immediately what it's like. Now, having listened to it for a few seconds, can you honestly look me in the eye and tell me that it would be possible for a corporation to come up with some clever advertisement and induce a high school cheerleader to start listening to that kind of stuff? No, of course not. Something like that it's meant to be extremely inaccessible. Okay? Corporations might be able to persuade people to buy certain products, but they're able to do so mainly through a leveraging of social pressure. And you can only leverage social pressure if there's already a substantial trend going into something. If a large number of people are already doing some particular thing or buying some particular product. Now, something as inaccessible as that album, you're not going to have tens of millions of people listening to that. You're not going to have Suffocation songs on pop radio. That's never going to happen. You're not going to induce, normie, basic bitch, high school cheerleaders to start listening to this stuff. It doesn't matter how you structure your ads. The power of corporations in this regard is limited. And I say that as a way of offering hope, as a way of trying to at least partially white pill the people who are worried about this phenomenon. Yes, there's a worrying trend, and wokeism is coming to be mainstreamed, but don't worry. The pendulum will swing the other way. It always does. And this ties us back into the issue of tech censorship, the way in which tech companies are trying to throttle the story about Hunter Biden and his laptop and all the goodies and all the weird shit that's on it. Those most worried about this trend say that Google possesses an enormous and unprecedented amount of power and control over the world's information resources. And if the state does not step in and get it to behave and stop censoring people, then it will be able to twist society into whatever shape it pleases. And therefore that we have a unique case that Google must be stopped, that we can't simply allow the kind of natural evolution of the market to wipe away Google. That the answer, well, go start your own tech company, isn't good enough because somehow things will never shift and you'll never ever be in a position to compete with Google or the likes of them. But of course, that's not true. Of course, this case isn't unique. Things will change. You are already seeing it. The trouble is, what you're seeing is in its early stages. There are already platforms like Library, like BitChute, blockchain-based technology, things I've mentioned before, Skycoin, Blockstack, that sort of thing. Technologies seeking and striving to recreate the internet on an entirely new footing, such that banning and deplatforming and these other deplorable things will no longer be possible. The trouble is that it's very difficult to convince some of the people who are worried about tech censorship that these new things that I'm pointing to will eventually, in the course of time, overthrow the likes of Google and Facebook. It's difficult to convince them of this because these things are in their early stages. The people involved in them are innovators and early adopters. The trend is small. It's a relatively unknown subculture. And it may be difficult to imagine for people how it might be that this small ragtag group of hackers and computer nerds that are playing around with their esoteric programming concepts, how it might be that they might take down these massive multi-billion-dollar, in some cases over $1 trillion corporations and thereby restructure the world and the world economy and the ways in which we consume information and so forth. But you must remember, Google, Facebook, years ago, Mark Zuckerberg and Sundar Pichai and Sergey Brin and all these other people, they were innovators once too. They were on the cusp of something once too, and they overthrew their old order. And now it's their turn to be overthrown. It will happen. This case is not different from all of the others. Not to worry. Things are going to be all right. There is going to be a way for information to get out, and those who wish to find it and consume it and learn it will have ways to do that. Google will not stop this. It's not going to be able to put this genie in the bottle, but genie back in the bottle. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say. That's the explanation for why woke capitalism is a thing. It's a fad. People are signaling, and eventually people are going to get tired of it. They're going to start counter-signaling. That counter-signaling will become a fad. Corporations will jump on that, and the cycle will repeat. And this is just the way of things. And when that happens, the interesting people will leave. Things will become boring. And, rinse, repeat. Thank you for listening.